point, we're going to be looking at the English settlement. And I was talking about initially, if you think about the Spanish, they're over here in 1492, and the English don't create a permanent settlement in the New World until 1607. So, the Spanish have an over 100-year head start. You need to keep that in the back of your mind. Now, at about the same time, the French settled their first major outpost in the New World, and that's what was then called Quebec. Today, it would be Quebec City, the old the old capital, but it's Quebec in Canada. That's what New France is, the year after Jamestown. And in what is now the continental United States, the Spanish reassert some authority in New Mexico. So you kind of have keep in mind, St. Augustine was already in existence, 1585, but these are kind of like the three big dogs of North America, excluding the native, obviously. So with these three settlements, you're going to see who the next 100 years, more 150 years of conflict in North America over who gets to control it. Keep in mind, the Spanish almost entirely focus on Central and South America. Columbus never set foot in our country, the United States, but these are the three settlements here: Santa Fe down in New Mexico, Quebec up in Canada, and Jamestown, of course. So this is going to kick off the beginning of North American exploration. So initially, England was slow to do this. I'll remind you that in the 1500s, there had been a guy named John Cabot, actually late 1400s. Early 1500s, John Cabot had come over here and kind of laid a claim a little bit for Henry VII. But during the reign of Henry VIII, England was allied with Spain. You may recall that that Henry VIII was married to the daughter of the rulers of Spain. He was married to Catherine of Aragon. So Spain and England were friends throughout much of the 1500s, which meant they had little interest in trying to create a conflict with their ally. And also throughout the 1500s, definitely, King Henry had really, thrown the entire Church of England, the Catholic Church, and then later the Anglican Church, into turmoil by wanting his marriage nullified. And then they had gone back and forth. After his death, Edward VI, as a young boy, the church became more Protestant. And he died, and Bloody Mary takes the throne and reinstates Catholicism, and then she dies. And so finally, in 1558, Queen Elizabeth becomes ruler of England. So when we think about American exploration, it's an Elizabethan era, beginning really. So she's ruler in 1558 till 1603. So that throughout this pre-Jamestown, it's all Queen Elizabeth's rule. And she has made it very clear that she is not a friend of Spain. She is a Protestant herself. She sees Spain as the imperial power. King Philip II is a rival, a major threat to her. So she is going to do everything she can to diminish the Spanish power, to weaken them. She's also got an uprising in Ireland, which every English ruler since King Henry VIII has had. And so she's going to send some of her lieutenants, her loyal subjects, to fight and slaughter the Irish. It's where they're going to pioneer sort of a brutal style of warfare, like scorched earth, that will become known as the Irish tactics. These are not tactics of the Irish. These are the English tactics on the Irish. Very, very brutal. They'll burn their villages and do stuff like that. They look at the Irish as like savages. So when they settle in North America, they already have some experience at fighting, quote, savages. They just will bring those tactics to bear on the Native Americans. And Queen Elizabeth was very fond of and sponsored sailors who would attack Spanish stuff and plunder them. Most famously, Sir Francis Drake. Drake will be the second sailor whose crews circumnavigate the globe. As he goes around the world, everywhere he stops, that's a Spanish port, he attacks the Spanish ships and steals their gold. So these are like the very original Pirates of the Caribbean kind of thing. And he's so popular that Queen Elizabeth knights him. She makes him, he was a commoner, and she makes him Sir Francis Drake when his ship returned with like a half a ton of gold from Spain. Now, one of her subjects is a fellow named Sir Humphrey Gilbert. He's going to try to come over here and sort of hang out where the Vikings had, but he gets killed. He gets killed. I think it's a shipwreck off the coast of Newfoundland. And so it's his half brother who gets the sort of fame or claim who comes to America in 1585, and he will be the one who names the North American coastline Virginia after his queen. Some scholars think Raleigh may have had a relationship with Queen Elizabeth. Hard to say for sure, but it is clear that he names everywhere from northern Georgia all the way to Maine, Virginia. So when we think about Virginia, that was the entire coast of the future United States back then. And he sets up a what he hopes to be a permanent colony on the Outer Banks. Not the best place to set up a colony, and it's known in history as the Lost Colony or Roanoke Island. Scholars today are almost certain that the folks that he leaves them behind and heads back to England. Unfortunately, when he gets back to England, there's a colossal war with Spain going on, so he can't come back. And so when he finally does come back, the colony's all gone. And so the belief is that the colony was either killed or probably absorbed by the local Croatan natives. So in other words, they just intermingled with them or were killed by them. So that's why the Roanoke Island is the lost colony. But like I said, he goes back to England just in time for this colossal event. And so we talked about the word epochal before, like world changing. This is an epochal event, a world changing event. When the forces of Philip II, he has launched a naval invasion attempt of England. Keep in mind, nobody invades England by water anymore. The last time that was done was 1066 AD. So he tries to sail an armada, a fleet of ships across the channel, and the very famous storm comes up, sometimes known as the Protestant wind, and the armada is defeated. And with the defeat of the Spanish armada, you have the beginning of the decline of the Spanish power. That's their navy is now defeated. Meanwhile, and one of the reasons why Philip tried to invade is that Queen Elizabeth has been steadily aiding the Dutch in the Netherlands and their independence from Spain. So she is clearly marked that they're her enemy, and Philip wants to kill her. He calls her a heretic. But this is a perfect time for England to begin its rise. And so when you think about the Elizabethan age, this is the period when England rises to sort of the beginning of its supremacy. It will be interesting that briefly the Dutch are the naval power in the world, and that's why you're going to have New Netherlands in another chapter. But at the end, England gets what Spain had in the late 1400s, which is the dominant navy in the world. They are a United Nation state, but Queen Elizabeth is a religiously tolerant ruler. She doesn't hunt down and persecute Catholics. So, in other words, this period in history of English settlement, English colonization, is the golden age in England. Shakespeare will write a play about sailors trying to come to America. It's called The Tempest, and it's about a shipwreck in the Indies. So this is the beginning. Initially they were late, like I said, about a century behind, but now they're ready to come. Okay, so with Elizabeth's support, you have people trying to go out and settle, but they're not having a whole lot of success. Part of the problem is she is not in any way going to organize English governmental settlement. So if you want to think about the major difference between Spain and England, the people who conquer and settle the New World from Spain are directly under the employ of the government. So if you think about, be they Hernandez Soto or any of the other names that we've just gone over, they literally were employees of the crown. English people aren't employed by Queen Elizabeth to come over here. In fact, she's got a guy who really tries to almost propagandize settlement of America. He's telling how great it is and how awesome it is, because nobody's really trying. England's not doing that. Well, things are going to begin to change, and that is the reason why you're going to see people start migrating to the New World ultimately. First of all, is a sense. Now, it's not necessarily legitimate. I think your text points out that there were more people in London today than there are in the entire country of England then. So, it wasn't truly overcrowded, but it sure felt that way. It felt like there were people everywhere, particularly because of a movement that was occurring and had been occurring for the last half century called the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement is a historic event when people who were back then, people shared the common land that was owned by a wealthy landowner. And so they would work on it. They would farm on it, kind of like a medieval sharecropper. But under the enclosure movement, fences were built around the land and sheep were grazed. And that meant most people were no longer able to grow crops, and thus they became unemployed and homeless. And thus they were roaming about, looking for somewhere to go. So some of the people who moved to the New World, to our country, are these folks that are displaced, displaced as a result of the enclosure movement. They're homeless people. But another major factor goes all the way back to Middle Ages, and it's the laws governing land in England. There were two particular laws in England that prevented land from in any way being distributed or subdivided, if you know that phrase. So one of those was primogeniture. Primogeniture. You could translate that to first gen, right? First generation, firstborn. So what happened was when an estate, a landowner, a lord, a noble, a duke, a baron, when they had a son, their eldest son inherited the entire estate. They didn't break it up between heirs. They got the whole thing. And so what that meant was a lot of sort of second sons and third sons had to depend on their older brothers for income. They had to depend on their family for an allowance, basically. And that really, embarrassed. They didn't like that. That was they didn't feel free. So a lot of the people who come over in the first wave of Virginia settlement are second born sons of noblemen. They're trying to strike out and make it rich on their own. So try to think that's primogeniture's impact on it. So a lot of the guys at Jamestown have never worked a day in their life. And that's very important to understand. They're like rich, spoiled kids who come over here and think they're going to find gold. And then you got this commoner telling them they're going to have to raise corn. And they're like, oh, screw that. So these are not farming kids. These are the rich sons, so to speak. And then entail meant you couldn't split up the land ever. So this is one of the reasons why people in England, you could never get ahead. You could never gain property. You just kind of had to, the same old families always had it. But on the flip side, there was an emerging middle class throughout Europe because of the commercial revolution. This was in both England and Holland and around Europe. And that was a merchant class that were not tied to land. In other words, their wealth was independent of land ownership. These were not large estate owners. They owned businesses, kind of the emerging business class. And so what they did is, we might call them today nouveau riche. They were the new money. And so they were able to pool their money and finance these very important concepts called joint stock companies. So let's say you owned a tannery or a brewery in England and you had some money to spend. And you said, well, what am I going to do with this money? Well, you could invest it in a American sort of risk. It was taking a risk. These were entrepreneurs. So when we think about the folks that settled at Jamestown, they were employees, not of the crown, but of a company. These are like McDonald's or Walmart employees settling in Virginia to make money. That was their objective. So don't think of these as like religious freedom people or, people here to Christianize. They came over here for the distinct purpose of making money. And that's, kind of why it's slow going, because this was a high risk venture. To invest money in the wilderness, usually you weren't necessarily going to have a good return on your investment. So be sure to know what a joint stock company is. Okay. And you definitely want to know that this was a new development. England is fairly new to this. Okay. So let's take a look at our hometown. And I do love it. Keep in mind, you're a citizen of the United States, but you're also a citizen of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And Virginia, every time I go to national, teacher things and people are like, where are you from? I'm like, I'm from the greatest state in the Union, man. I'm from the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Old Dominion, the first state, the really first state, not Delaware. So Virginia has an extraordinary history, but this isn't necessarily the most positive part of it. So let's take a look. So here you have this company. It's a business. So it's chartered. It has an agreement. The Queen, in this case, the King, his name is King James I, Scottish King, charters with Parliament a business. So that means they had a permit to operate here. But in their charter is a really important component. The employees of the Virginia Company, when they come to America, have the same rights as Englishmen in England. That is going to be a long-standing important event, because if these people are still Englishmen and still have the same rights, then they have to be treated under the law the same. And that is ultimately the very issue of no taxation without representation, right? That's English people's rights. So they're going to keep this. And What's interesting is they bring the charter to America so that the monarch can't change the charter. Like by having this signed document, they're like, oh, it's official. You can't amend it or alter it. Okay, so even the Commonwealth's future governing laws will have this component to it. So having American liberties was not, and I really do want to emphasize this because sometimes students don't seem to get it. America fought its independence because its rights as Englishmen were violated by England, not its theoretically natural rights, although that's certainly what Thomas Jefferson is going to say. But the thing that ticks George Washington off is he doesn't get treated like a fellow Englishman. So when these guys start out, they're Englishmen, they're not Americans, but they will sometimes use the word American. And I want to emphasize, for them, it was a geographic term. When they called themselves Americans, they meant English people living in America. Later on, of course, it means a nationality, but that wasn't the case at that moment. Okay, and so in 1606, the Virginia Company sends out its 3 ships. Usually, if you ask Americans what 3 ships that went to Jamestown, they're going to give you the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Not really English ships at all. But the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery set out as business ships. And they come into the Chesapeake Bay. If you've ever been to Chesapeake Bay, beautiful place. It's a perfect natural harbor. In fact, one of the largest harbors in the world. If you go down to Norfolk, this is the home of it is our largest naval base. So this is a really ideal place. But the problem is that it's so nice and open, the Spanish could just sail right in, and they don't want that to happen. So they kind of look around, and then when they look for a place, they get attacked, and so they're like, "Oh, that didn't work." So they keep moving around the Chesapeake until they find what we now call, and they named, the James River. Okay, and so it's only about 100 guys. Almost all of them are young by the standard of just about in it. They're in their 20s, and they are under the leadership that the ships are of an individual named Christopher Newport. He's their admiral. So if you've ever heard of Christopher Newport University or Newport News, he's the guy. But in reality, when they get here, they're going to be led, or kind of like their management will be a council that has been selected by the Virginia Company. So in other words, this council or this sort of like management team has been picked by the Virginia Company, and they're going to be the guys in charge. Okay. And the reason they land at the James River, and I'm going to show you this on a map, is it's a very well defendable spot. The James Peninsula that they choose can be guarded by a fort, and they can see ships coming up if they're from Spain. And defend that way. They also have an open like a plain behind them, field, so they can see Indian attacks coming. So you have it's a relatively good defensive spot. Unfortunately, it's in a swamp, and so that's not the best place for food, for example, and really not the best place if you're trying to avoid malaria, because mosquitoes are swarming everywhere. But nonetheless, that's where they settle. There are the replicas of the ships. They're always talked about being tiny ships, but they were the same size ships as what was typical of that day. They weren't tiny. They're tiny to us, not much bigger than a yacht. But here is where they settled. So here's the Chesapeake Bay. And this, if you follow Chesapeake Bay up, which is where they initially tried, you keep going all the way up, you'll get to Washington, D.C. This is a really neat thing. This is the Delmarva Peninsula. This is the part of Virginia that connects all the way up to Maryland and Delaware, so they call it Delmarva. And this is where you can see the Atlantic Ocean is. So it's right around here. This is all saltwater, okay? And they sail right past the Norfolk Naval Base, Hampton Roads. And then here is Jamestown on the tip of a peninsula. And this darker area, if you can't tell, is where it goes from saltwater into freshwater. But if you take a look at this map, there's some other things you might notice that are useful. Where the English are going to settle is all along the river. And these things that say 100, that's representing or referencing 100 acres. So these are like little relatively sizable plantations all along the James River. But the fort, if an attack or if something violent happened, they would retreat back to the fort at Jamestown. So the English settled all along here. Now, if you follow this map all the way up the James River, and I've actually canoed down this all the way to the Chesapeake, but this Henrico right here is Richmond. So here today Richmond wasn't called Richmond then. But here is, if you follow that, that's Richmond in the James River, the falls of the James, they call it. And then if you go up above the York River, you'll see Werowocomoco. So see if you can spot Werowocomoco right here. This is Powhatan's village. Now, Powhatan is the chief of this entire area, but this is his village. So are they relatively close? You better believe it. They literally land in the middle of Powhatan's sort of rule in his territory. And so that's kind of important thing to keep in mind. Okay, now some problems that might persist. Obviously, water is fresh here, but we've already mentioned, that people got sick a lot. And then, of course, if for some reason a Spanish ship blocked them, they're stuck here. And they are entirely surrounded by Native Americans. So these folks were isolated. They kind of set up a Dollar General in the middle of a Native American outpost, and that's, might work here in Pennsylvania County, but they're highly at risk at this location. So this is a drawing by John Smith of the fort. Fort probably looked pretty close to this, not quite the same location, but you'll notice even in Smith's drawings, it's right up near the river. The reason for this is they're going to want to put gold on ships that can just sail right out to the ocean. So here's an English ship, comes in, picks up its gold, turns around, goes out. That's the hope. Here, the reason why we have to computer generate it, as mentioned earlier, is that all of this is underwater. So you can't. This is where the fort was. Here's where the James River is, and took it over. But you get an idea of what the fort looked like. These are where the cannons would be placed. And they had these Mott and Dobble houses that were very Shakespearean looking. Not the best place to live. And you guys are gonna watch a video on YouTube about the starving time. So there's settlement. They did set up a church. It was one of their stated objectives. And here's what happened. So in that first year, 40 people out of the 100 didn't even make it. They got sick on the boat or they died on the voyage. By the way, a supply ship that was supposed to come behind them got shipwrecked in Bermuda. So, stuff gets shipwrecked in Bermuda a bunch. You think the Bermuda Triangle is not a new development. And that's 1609. So this was supposed to be carrying supplies and it didn't make it. So this was the resupply ship and so they don't get any. Now take a look at this. If you are a wealthy person, you weren't used to farming. You didn't know how to farm, okay? You just expected gold to be laying in the water. Cortez didn't have to farm. So these guys come over here thinking they're going to be Cortez, and they're really, really out of luck because if you know anything about Eastern Virginia, there's not like a huge deposit of gold and silver everywhere. And so because of that, they don't even know really well how to hunt. Their oysters at the time were as big as platters. John Smith talks about like saucer-sized oysters. They don't catch the fish. They're deer in the wood. I mean, if you think the deer in the woods here, imagine without, like Western civilization in America, how many deer there must have been. So, just really wasted time. They mined, so to speak. They panned, if you've ever seen people panning for gold. They got in the James River and physically scraped the sides of the walls of the dirt, trying to find gold in it. And by the way, this absolutely doesn't work. They fail miserably. And look at what happens. There are only 38 left of them after the first winter. Okay, so they got almost a 70% fatality rate. All right, so next year, 300 new, and again, all men, immigrants come, and by that spring, they're 60. So the first 2.5 years at Jamestown are colossal failures in terms of starvation and deprivation. The dive exposure. I mean, these people have built buildings that still freeze to death. So it's just really terrible. So over the course of the next 14 years, 10,000 people are going to come. And at the end of that period, only 1,200 will remain. So, by the time from 1607 to 1624, there have been, something like 10,000 people died, in the span of, and that's almost the entire group. And that really, by the way, at this point, by 1624, the crown in England says, you guys are really screwing up. You're killing off my subjects and you don't get to be in charge anymore. So eventually they stop being a joint stock company run territory and they'll have a British governor over them. In other words, a royal governor, like a viceroy. But initially, this is just a business. And you can imagine if Walmart was losing 10,000 people over the course of 10 years, there would be a whole lot of government saying, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? So people didn't live very long. Maximum life expectancy was about 40. A lot of the people who came over were like 17 to 22-year-olds and didn't make it. If you did actually get married, which keep in mind, they had to capture women to bring them to America. There's a poem about it, The Trapped Maiden. If you actually had a kid, 80% of them died before they were kindergartner age. So this doesn't really sell itself as a great beginning of our country, does it? And it has to do, again, with the way that the English crown was not in any way orchestrating this. This was all just sort of a side business, and it wasn't working. Now, one of the things that kept it, I think, from completely dying is a guy who was on that council. Now, I will say this, folks, you don't have to write all these statistics down. Please don't. It's a situation where all you have to remember is a whole lot of people starved to death. And I am serious. One man killed his wife and ate her. Another guy dug up a corpse and ate it. They were killing the horses. It was absolutely the worst kind of behavior you can imagine. But it's because of this guy that it's probable, at least, you're always, whenever we talk about John Smith, going to have to take him with a grain of salt, because the biography of John Smith was the autobiography of John Smith. And he is already known in history for someone who makes stuff up. So it's a tricky thing studying John Smith, because sometimes he's an unreliable narrator. Like he apparently embellished. He kind of talked himself up. But nonetheless, John Smith is here. And what's interesting to me about John Smith is he's on that inaugural voyage, that 1607 voyage. And on the trip over, he's telling people, hey, man, y'all are going to have to get ready to deal with the natives, the people that live there. Y'all are going to have to make plans to eat and feed each other. John Smith was a mercenary. That's why he's called captain. He's got a really interesting biography. He had gone and fought against the Ottoman Empire as a mercenary and gotten captured and managed to escape, according to him, by the help of a beautiful woman. So John Smith's always getting saved by beautiful women, at least in his own biography. But nonetheless, he was a world traveler, and he had fought against people. And he's telling these people, look, man, y'all have got to get your act together. And these rich dudes get real mad. They're like, you're just an ordinary commoner. Shut up. And so he keeps doing it. So they lock him in chains. And they're planning to kill him when they get to Virginia. When they get here, he's going to be executed. But when they land here, Newport opens up the instructions. That's what they were told to do. He opens up the instructions from the Virginia Company. And one of the council members is John Smith. He's been appointed by the company to run their defenses. So they can't kill him. And he's like, ha ha, I'm a council member now. So what he then says is he imposes a law. And he says, once he sees all this desire for gold, 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 right? But he institutes a very famous saying. He says, those who do not work do not eat. And so he's the guy who kind of says, we're going to have to pay attention to the natives and figure out how to get food supplies. Gold, we'll get that maybe later. But right now we have to survive. It's an existential threat. So John Smith is a pragmatist. I always think of him as the guy who figured out it doesn't matter what gold you find if you can't survive. So he's the guy who is going to impose what we call a work regimen. And by this point, most of those second-born sons have died anyway. And so he comes in, and this is what happens to him. I always think this is a neat story. First of all, John Smith is the guy who negotiates with Pocahontas, very famous ambassador. But we know a lot about Jamestown because of John Smith. Now, John Smith is going to get set on fire in 1609. Like he's going to burn himself. Back then, they carried their gunpowder around in like open containers because the guns that they used, you had to pour the gunpowder on a tray. So it was actually like exposed. So fires from gunpowder weren't uncommon. And so he actually had gunpowder fall on his chest on fire and burnt him badly, like severely burned, so much so that he had to go back to England. And he does. But then when he's in England, he writes his General History of Virginia. You can see the date here, right? 1614. So if you want to go back and think 1614, how are they doing so far by then? They only had about 100 people out of all that had come over. So not very good time. And this is what he says. It's crazy to me. We all found the loss of Captain Smith. Now, keep in mind, Captain Smith is the guy writing this. So I would be like telling you, you all felt the loss of Mr. Touart. Like that sounds a little arrogant, right? So we all found the greatest maligners. Now, a maligner is somebody who would criticize, and Smith was criticized, Canal curse is lost. As for corn and contribution from the savages, meaning Native Americans, we had nothing, and this is like a typo in the writing, but mortal wounds with clubs and arrows. So in other words, once Smith left, the Indians killed us. Nay, so great was our famine that a savage we slew and buried. The poor sort took him up and ate him. So now they're talking about some of the poor Jamestown settlers eating a Native American. Diverse one another, boiled and stewed with roots. So they made a stew out of Native American. Okay, this was that time, which to this day we call the starving time. So this is John Smith saying that. It was too vile to say and scarce to be believed what we endured. But the occasion was reason for want of. In other words, the reason we had it was our own fault for want of hard work and government, and not anything wrong with the country. So in other words, we're starving, not because you can't grow food here that's not available. It's because we didn't do anything. For then until 3 years, like I said, 1609, where the numbers was landed, we have never from England's provision sufficient. So we're not getting supplied by our company, and we're starving to death. And this guy ate this Indian. So, that's John Smith saying how badly he was missed. And this is a historian saying this. English expectations of the Native Americans died hard. America was supposed to be a land of abundance with natives who would not only give us their abundance, but increase it under English leadership. Now, here's the thing I want to remind you. Native Americans did not grow surplus foods. They only grew enough food for their tribe to last through the winter. So when the English come to them in the winter and say, we want your food, that was the Indians' food. Like, that was it. That's all they had. So it would have been like, even then, they still found ways to help the English, but they weren't like running around with surplus food supply. It's not like you could walk into a food lion. All right. Englishmen did not envision a need to work just to survive. During this pandemic, I think people have realized, gee, what happened if my food supply got disrupted? What happened if Food Line or Walmart's food wasn't available? A lot of folks around here be up the creek. Now, a lot of folks around here do know how to grow food and do know how to go shoot something, but kind of the country boy can't survive. The problem was these Englishmen were not country boys. They were city boys, and they were in the wilderness. I mean, you imagine walking into the wilderness and expecting the Indians to take care of you. And the problem of survival was at best political and at worst military. Although Englishmen long remained under the illusions Indians would become useful subjects, pretty early on, it was clear that wasn't the case. Powhatan views these people as inferiors. The reports are that when Powhatan sees them, it's more curiosity than anything that keeps the English alive. Because at any point during those first 14 years, or 10 years certainly, the Powhatan could have come in and slaughtered the English because they were on the verge of collapse anyway. So on Monday, we're going to pick up with Powhatan and Pocahontas, his daughter, and we're going to talk about the Native Americans assisting the English and then later warring with the English as part of the Jamestown experience. So with that, we'll conclude today, and I'll answer